What do you see as the role of therapy in a spiritual life or spiritual journey?
I think this is a very timely question, Stephen, and it's part of an even larger question. That is, what is the optimal relationship between the spiritual practices, which are now available to us uh, for the first time culture-wide, plus the historically unique fact that we also have a variety of psychological and therapeutic practices also available to us. And I think there are a variety of perspectives people have taken on these. And if we look at them historically, when, for example, Buddhism first came to the West, Dharma teachers tended to look down on therapy. It's just reinforcing the ego, etc. And the psychologists, therapists sometimes spoke of it as being just bypassing. And there can be, there's, of course, as with so many things, there's a grain of truth there. I think what we're gradually coming to is a more sophisticated recognition that first, contemplative practice doesn't do it all. It does not necessarily handle early wounds. It's not necessarily good for example, one's work in the world, various applications. On the other hand, psychotherapeutic work can lead to spiritual openings, but it's rare. And the psychological worldview is usually a pretty truncated one in which the transpersonal capacities and levels of and possibilities of the psyche are simply not recognized, sometimes even dismissed. So I think we're coming to now to an appreciation that they can be quite complementary. And
Right.
I'm not aware that we have any research on this yet, but clearly among my own exploration with a variety of teachers and therapists, there seems to be an appreciation that contemplative practice can speed psychotherapy. And I've worked with a variety of, as a professor of psychiatry, I've worked with a number of people who have a spiritual practice, and sometimes they can just move very quickly. You don't have to teach them to turn attention inward. What are you feeling, etc. They know that, and they know they have that capacity very well. So things can move very quickly. Likewise, in spiritual practice, we've all seen students who just keep ruminating on things or recycling. And in those cases, it can be very appropriate to recommend therapy. And I certainly know a lot of spiritual teachers who feel that their students have benefited significantly from that. I think this is part of a larger question, and that is, what is the proper relationship between spiritual practices and psychotherapies and pharmacotherapies? For example, my role as both a contemplative practitioner and a sometime teacher, plus as a psychiatrist, I've had a number of people come to me who are deep practitioners, some of them well-known teachers themselves, who by virtue of genetics or early history have significant depressive episodes still. And I would say that can be very important to recognize that sometimes that, again, spiritual practice doesn't necessarily do it all, that there can be early wounds or genetic traits that just really aren't very well dealt with by spiritual practice alone, and that it can be a real trap to have a kind of spiritual superego to think, that the answer to all problems are practice harder, sit more, etc. And that can be really devastating. And so the complement of spiritual practice, psychotherapy, and pharmacotherapy, if needed, can be extremely valuable. We did a little research study on I think 20 practitioners who suffered from depression and were on antidepressants. What they basically told us was that the antidepressants gave them a kind of equanimity, which enabled them to, in some cases, to begin their practice again, and in some cases, to begin and maintain their practice so they could then get off the antidepressants. I think that's the kind of ideal integration of approaches that one's looking for.
Yeah, great answer. That's helpful to see. It is such a dynamic now, and of course, in modern day America, at least, there's a fair number of teachers who are therapists or trained in psychological arts. So there is, the crossover has happened in that regard. I teach in Europe some, and Europe is not where we are, particularly in California, around therapy, where I had someone who had a very significant childhood trauma. And I mentioned, well, you might want to, spend some time with a therapist. And they looked like I slapped them in the face. And I asked the interpreter afterwards, what was that? And they said, oh, we only go to psychiatrists when somebody's crazy. So basically, you were telling him he's crazy. So I had to go, of course, find him and communicate all this in a way that he could understand. But that's how it was. You're saying in the early days, there was a real difference, a real separation between the two that fortunately hasn't maintained.
Yeah, and I would just mention Jack Cornfield, who I think was one of the real pioneers in bringing these two worlds together, and did a very beautiful article, which is quite pivotal in shifting people's thinking around this.